decision to turn him in, how did that evolve?
Well, we knew right away that that was our only course of action.
The biggest name in Wall Street fraud is Bernie Madoff, whose Ponzi scheme robbed investors of $20 billion. Madoff is in prison, and his family has been in seclusion.
The chairman of Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, LLC, which he founded in 1960. That name may not say a lot to you, but you go over to Madoff and you talk to Bernie and he mentions, oh, by the way, 10% of stocks traded in the United States are going through this firm right now. You sort of raise this question, which is, okay, commissions are almost nothing, and yet you are a for-profit enterprise, and maybe we can bring Josh into it too. How do you guys make money then?
Let's take a look at the Bernie Madoff countdown clock and see how he's doing. He's got 148 years, 7 months, 13 days, 9 hours, 10 minutes, and 13 seconds left.
Neil Friedman has started a new career. Even though he is 81 years old, Friedman is trying to make his photography business bring in a little money after he lost a lifetime's worth of savings to Bernie Madoff.
Last night on 60 Minutes, I watched Ruth Madoff, Bernie Madoff's wife, and Andrew, his son, tell people that they had no idea what was going on. Don't believe it.
$2 billion? That's what the government says JP Morgan has to pay for not warning about Bernie Madoff.
The anniversary of the collapse of the largest Ponzi scheme in history by Bernard Madoff. Joining me right now is attorney and partner at Becker Polyakov, Helen Chapman. She represents over 1,600 Madoff victims.
My next guest today is Helen Chapman, who co-authored with Lance Gofferman a very popular book, JP Madoff, The Unholy Alliance Between America's Biggest Bank and America's Biggest Crook. It is a very well-researched book with over 1,200 footnotes, so for those of our viewers who want to delve into the case in more detail than what we can do today, there is a lot more information at their disposal. I should say at the outset that my guest was herself a victim of the fraud and lost most of her life savings. Now, as one of America's leading attorneys, she represents victims of the $65 billion scam. She says her experience has led her to have a very different view about money. Maybe we can talk a little about that later. But first, Helen, let me quote you from your own words because I find them to be both fascinating and terrifying. All the big banks are basically criminal organisations, and most of them regularly engage in fraud. I could have written this book about HSBC, Bank of America, or Citigroup. All the banks and the government encourage them to do this. All the banks have been operating like criminal enterprises. The bankers have become such criminals, it threatens the entire world economy. Wow. So I wonder what President Obama would have to say about this if I asked him. That's not much help. What about Janet Yellen at the Federal Reserve?
Monetary policy will, of course, change. So let me stop there.
So Helen, tell us about those folks at JP Morgan Chase and their good friend Bernie Madoff.
Well, first let me go back to the quote that you read, because it sounds a little bit extreme, but in fact it's 100% accurate. And if you go on my website, jpmadoff.com, in the middle of the home page, I have a roulette wheel. And if you click on the roulette wheel, it spins, and it lands on a different slice of the roulette wheel each time you spin it. And the total slices on the roulette wheel total $36 billion that JP Morgan Chase has paid in fines and settlements just in the last 4 years for violating the consumer fraud laws, for violating the antitrust laws, for conspiring to manipulate LIBOR, for conspiring to manipulate the foreign exchange rate. There is no law that JP Morgan Chase won't break in order to enrich itself at the expense of its customers. And I could say the same thing for any of the major banks, HSBC, Bank of America, Citibank. They were all co-conspirators in the LIBOR criminal antitrust activity. They were all co-conspirators in the foreign exchange rate activity. They get together to fix prices, and the victims are the honest, hardworking people around the world. And the banks operate with impunity because, for whatever reason, President Obama and his brilliant Attorney General Eric Holder decided that big-time criminals belong on Wall Street, and we want to keep them there. We don't want it to make them disgorge their profits. We want to keep them there healthy and happy so they can ride home in their limousines to Greenwich every day and continue to steal from the average person.
Gosh, and tell us a little about this whale fiasco that was set up by Jamie Dimon in London. It seems that Madoff's scam was going global, am I right?
You know, there's a very interesting connection. Of course, I've never spoken to Jamie Dimon, and if I did, he wouldn't confirm this. But Jamie Dimon joined JP Morgan Chase in the summer of 2004. And at that time, Madoff was keeping on deposit at JP Morgan Chase in his what we call the 703 account, which was the account through which he operated the fraudulent investment advisory business. He kept on deposit $3 to $6 billion. Now, I'm old enough to remember when in New York City, you were induced to open up a bank account with $5,000 because you'd get a free toaster. So what do you get if you leave $3 to $5 billion on deposit at JP Morgan Chase? You get a lot of protection. You have to pay a lot of money for it, but you get a lot of protection. And Jamie Dimon, seeing this, had money that he could speculate with. This was depositors' money. He could speculate with it. And lo and behold, one of the first things he did when he came to JP Morgan Chase was bring over Ina Drew, who used to work for him, and he gave her carte blanche to go out and hire the youngest, most aggressive traders that she could find. And he set up the chief investment office in London. And should we be surprised that Bruno Ixel and some of the other traders, they did well for a while, and then they incurred what's certainly more than a $6.4 billion loss. Jamie Dimon and Chase have never disclosed the full extent of the loss, but they did disclose that it was $6.4 billion.
Gosh, and was anyone inside JPMC charged with scrutinising these transactions to protect their customers from fraud?
Well, absolutely. This went to the very top of the bank. In fact, the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations, which under the former head of it, who was a terrific guy, was one of the most important organizations in Washington. They did an analysis of all of JP Morgan Chase's emails, and they established that the knowledge of what was going on in London reached the very highest levels of the bank. So Jamie Dimon knew, all of his senior officers knew, everybody knew what was going on. And according to the Senate subcommittee, Jamie Dimon committed securities law violations by concealing from the public the extent of the losses at a time when he indisputably knew about it.
Gosh, and what about outside regulators, if you like, organisations charged with protecting the public from such unscrupulous people?
Well, you know, it's very interesting because another thing that came out in this Senate report is that, you know, they published emails that the very senior executives at the board level and the senior executives would write indignant letters about what the regulators were doing. They would deliberately lie to the regulators. They have nothing but contempt for the regulators, and they treat them like servants that they don't have to really talk to. And unfortunately, the regulators tolerate all of that. Now, why do they do that? It goes right to President Obama, because this is the executive branch of the government, and Obama knowingly allowed this to go on.
So tell us about the conflict of interest between people like Eric Holder and Preet Bharara. Did I get that right?
Sure. Everybody, this is the famous revolving door. You work at the SEC for a couple of years and then you earn big bucks working on in one of the Wall Street firms. Eric Holder is a perfect example of this. He came up with this absolutely absurd, laughable idea that we can't prosecute anyone at the major financial institutions because we're so dependent upon those financial institutions that if we prosecute anyone, the global economy will collapse. Now, how can any intelligent person say that with a straight face? JP Morgan Chase, for one example, has 240,000 employees. Let's assume that 1,000 of them are the criminals responsible for all of the fantastically huge crimes that JP Morgan Chase has committed. If you took 1,000 people and you removed them from JP Morgan Chase and put them in prison where they belong, do we really think that JP Morgan Chase, with 239,000 other employees, would go out of business, that the whole economy would collapse because you take the criminals out of Wall Street? It's preposterous. And where is Eric Holder now? He's at Covington and Burling in Washington. Guess whom he's defending? JP Morgan Chase. How cozy is that?
Gosh. Let me quote you from your book again. You've said, "You would have to be brain dead through the last 14 years to believe that there is no connection between overcompensation and lack of ethics on Wall Street." Can you perhaps explain a little bit more about that statement?
Sure. You know, Jamie Dimon brags about how profitable JP Morgan Chase is. Well, why is it profitable? And then all of these, paid off stock analysts say, well, if you look at the capitalization of JP Morgan Chase and you think about, well, he's earning $25 or $30 million, it's a bargain in terms of the market value of the stock, because people love to have an organized criminal running a major financial institution. Of course he can make a lot of money. The mob made a lot of money too.
Very true.
Yeah, I mean, the banks have taken on the same model that organized crime had, except that they do, they look at the organized criminals. I mean, that was penny ante compared to what JP Morgan Chase gets involved with. I'll give you one example, which I think is particularly amazing. Karl Rove, who's the senator that I admired so much, who was head of the Subcommittee on Investigations. Unfortunately, he resigned from the Senate. But he did another study of the electric utility industry, and he developed evidence that JP Morgan Chase interviewed a young man for a job. And the kid said that he had worked at the electrical utility in California that supplied electricity to a large part of the state. And he said that the price for electricity was calculated pursuant to a very, very complicated formula. And he was a mathematical whiz, and he figured out that there was a glitch in the formula. And he told the people with whom he was interviewing at JP Morgan Chase that he could game the system and make billions of dollars in the process. Now, of course, the way he would make the billions of dollars is by grossly overcharging consumers in California for electrical power. Now, if you or I were interviewing this person, we wouldn't be able to get up quickly enough to kick this kid out of the door. Guess what JP Morgan Chase did? They hired him. They set him up with a whole team of people. They schemed to manipulate the electric rates in California so that the consumers were paying much more money than they should have. And guess how much money JP Morgan Chase was making? They estimated that they would be making $1.8 billion within a year. Now, how is it possible that we allow financial institutions like that to continue operating? It's just incredible.
It is.
And that story gives you a perfect example of who the victims are. The victims are every one of us in this country. We're all being victimized by the banks, and the government is allowing it to happen.
And who is this character, Cutler? It seems that he succumbed to the conduct that he was meant to prosecute. Can you comment there?
Well, yes, Steve Cutler. This is a perfect example of the revolving door, because when Steve Cutler was head of enforcement at the SEC, he was really aggressive, and he announced a policy of prosecuting lawyers who advised corporate officers, because he was really determined to drive out illegal conduct in the securities industry. And then, lo and behold, he leaves the SEC and he goes to work for JP Morgan Chase. And in fact, he was advising Jamie Dimon with respect to the non-disclosure of the scope of the losses that JP Morgan Chase was incurring pursuant to the London whale fiasco. So here's a guy who knows what he should be doing, and instead he's advising one of the biggest securities law criminals in modern times.
Gosh. I was interested when you said that Warren Buffett believes that excessive compensation to directors can hurt shareholders. You say that he pays board directors about $3,800 per year compared with JPMC's $245,000. They seem to neutralise the whistleblowers with money.
No question. No question. But, you know, when you look at the people who are on the board, that's one of the chapters that we enjoyed writing most of all, because you can't make this stuff up. You know, we've lost sight of we've lost sight of all values in this frenzy to become rich, and you wonder what people are doing with all this money. When you look at the people on the board and you see their former experience and how they took these massive bonuses when they left their organizations. And in fact, William Weldon, one of the members of the board who's grossly overcompensated, had been named by Harvard Business School as the worst CEO of the year. And so he's rewarded by being put on the board of JP Morgan Chase.
You're right, you can't make this stuff up. It's just amazing. You say that stock ownership by inside counsel should be illegal. In other words, that equity-based compensation is bad. Can you speak a little more about that?
We've got to break the cycle we're in. You know, the transfer of wealth in the United States in the last 30 years has been really shameful, because at this point, I think it's 90% of the wealth is owned by 1/10 of 1% of the people. And, you know, that can't last. If you look historically at what happens when there are civilizations where there's that kind of concentration of wealth, which is essentially, it means that 1/10 of 1% has really taken the money away from everyone else. And we certainly see that in the United States. There's such an imbalance and with the concentration of wealth. It's unsustainable. And I think that the amazing support that Bernie Sanders drew it was surprising to me. But I think it's very encouraging, because what it means to me is that the young people in this country recognize that we're heading down a path of disaster. But there's a kind of illness that's overtaken a lot of the people in this country. You know, whether you have $30 million or $1 billion or $3 billion or $50 billion, how does it change your lifestyle? How does it change anything you can do in life? I mean, what is this greed to violate laws in order to enrich yourself? It's a sickness that we're suffering right now.
That's very true. It's a foregone conclusion that in matters like this Madoff scandal, investigators need to follow the trail of money. I'm sure that in the very exhaustive research you must have done to compile the book, you would have almost become immune to the gigantic amounts of money that were being stolen. But I'm interested, Helen, you say that in the last 4 years, JPMC has paid $36 billion in fines for various crimes. And where's that money gone? And doesn't it suggest that there are more people who are benefiting from fraud than was originally thought?
Well, you know, the interesting thing, if you look at the fact that JP Morgan Chase knew that Madoff was committing crimes from the early 1990s on, and they kept him there. And, you know, under a statute that Congress enacted in 1970 called the Bank Secrecy Act, banks are required, as a matter of law, to understand their customer's business. The term is know your customer. There's an obligation to know your customer and to understand how your customer uses cash flow. And if you see something unusual, you have an obligation to report it to the federal government. And obviously, if you see illegal conduct, you should close the account down. Banks should not be complicitous in financial crimes. So here's a guy, Bernie Madoff, who comes in. He's conducting a massive money laundering operation at JP Morgan Chase. He and one of his co-conspirators, a guy named Norman Levy, had a money laundering operation that involved transfer of $106 billion over approximately 10 years from the early 1990s until 2002. Just in 2001, they transferred $36 billion between Norman Levy's account at JP Morgan Chase and Madoff's account at JP Morgan Chase. And JP Morgan Chase was on notice because they saw this going on in their bank. And yet they embraced Norman Levy. They figured this guy's a real player. They even gave him a suite of offices at their the private bank headquarters in Manhattan. It's inconceivable. It's unheard of that they would do that. But I guess they felt, God, this guy has something to teach us.
Gosh. Now, I'm interested, Helen, in what you think about the fraudulent activities on Wall Street and the coming financial meltdown that seems to be threatening the world at the moment. How much longer can the world's financial systems cope with this level of criminality? And will it perhaps be the very meltdown in the financial institutions that prop up Western capitalist systems that will eventually bring down the system and ultimately lead to its reform?
You know, I think that the present system is unsustainable. Whether it's going to take 3 years or 5 years or 20 years, I have no idea. But I think that the present system is unsustainable. I think that people are so overwhelmed with greed. And of course, the people on Wall Street are smart enough to share the wealth. They were major contributors to President Obama. They're major contributors to Hillary Clinton. But for Donald Trump's lunacy, they probably would be major contributors to Donald Trump. So I can't put a timeline on it, but I think that ultimately it's unsustainable. And as I said before, it's not just JP Morgan Chase. The other banks are equally culpable for this. And, you know, JP Morgan Chase does business with 50% of American households, 80% of Fortune 500 companies. And they figure out a way to cheat every single one of their customers. And they're so sophisticated about it. They're way ahead of their customers. Nobody can ever figure this out except after the fact.
Gosh. Let me quote you again, Helen. You've said, this country cannot move forward with integrity until it faces the fact that bankers have criminalized the financial services industry. Can you comment on that?
Yes, you know, I quote in the book Robert Kennedy, who made the statement that citizens get the quality of law enforcement that they demand. And I really feel that Americans have to stand up and demand that the next president of the United States put someone in charge of the Department of Justice who understands that if you're going to put some 17-year-old kid in prison for robbing a convenience store of $2,500, then you've got to put in prison all of the Wall Street criminals. And the irony of this is that the criminal laws, particularly we have a RICO statute, a racketeering statute, which was enacted in order to fight organized crime, but it fits perfectly with the criminals who are running the financial institutions. Under RICO, you could put Jamie Dimon in jail for all of the crimes that JP Morgan Chase has been committing. I mean, the most recent one, which is very funny, is we have a statute called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which makes it a crime to bribe a foreign officer, a foreign person in a business. Well, Jamie Dimon personally flew over to Hong Kong to interview the child of one of the major Chinese political figures because JP Morgan Chase was looking to hire the children of powerful political figures in order to enhance its business in China. And lest there be any doubt about what the bank's motivation was, they kept detailed records of each child of a powerful official they hired and how much business they got as a result of doing so. Now, this is a perfect example of what the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act criminalized. Is anyone at JP Morgan Chase going to jail? No. Is anyone being fired? No. They're paying $200 million and it's going away. Well, $200 million is a small percentage of the profits that they've made by their illegal conduct. So again, it's another example of the government encouraging the banks to continue to violate the law. They just have to make the government a partner in it. And you mentioned before who gets the money when all this money is paid in. It goes into the Treasury, and then Obama can brag about how much money that is in the Treasury. But the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is a crime which doesn't directly hurt a consumer, but mortgage fraud directly hurts consumers, and the penalties that are paid by the banks don't go to the victims. They go to the government.
Gosh. In your book, you've referred to the community of honest American citizens. Who are these people, Helen, and are there any left?
Well, the irony of it is they're the vast majority. They're the 99% of the people in this country. And the problem is that we have a breakdown in the political process in this country. We still have one man, one vote, but unfortunately, if you look at the people in Washington, in the House and in the Senate, that you can count on one hand the number of people who are genuine legislators. With everybody else, nobody reads the bills they vote for. They just count up how much money they've been paid to vote for or against the bill, and that's the way they vote. That we have a complete breakdown of the democratic process going on right now.
Well,
so the 99% of the people are not being represented. Congress represents the 0.1% who are just buying control of Washington.
Yeah, well, in your book, you're also very critical of the office of the president in cleaning up Wall Street. You've actually said the destruction of moral values we have experienced in this country as a result of President Obama's categorical refusal to enforce the criminal laws against Wall Street bankers is a problem that he has created, and for which he bears 100% of the responsibility. The enforcement of the criminal laws is within the jurisdiction of the president. He didn't need an act of Congress to indict Wall Street criminals. Can you talk about that?
Yes. A lot of the ways in which Obama has failed as a president, he can blame on Congress because obviously he had a very difficult time working with the Republicans. But I judge President Obama based on his performance as chief executive officer. And he had a lot of power simply because he was the president. He didn't need Congress to enforce the criminal laws of the United States against Wall Street criminals. That was his decision. It was his decision to appoint Eric Holder, who was absolutely unqualified for the position. It was his decision to allow Eric Holder not to prosecute anyone on Wall Street. And I think that this has been a terrible, terrible problem for the American people, and nobody really understands it. And we don't see a difference with Hillary Clinton because she has said that she intends to continue Obama's economic policies, which are let Wall Street eat up all the small people in the world and just devour them for lunch. And obviously everyone on Wall Street is fully supporting Hillary. And we can't expect if Donald Trump were to win that he would be any different, frankly, because he identifies only with people who have his kind of wealth and his kind of business activities. So you can see that from his economic advisors. He's chosen people who have made money the same way he has made money. And he's not going to go after the banks. So it's going to be many years before we can have the possibility of having a president who will do the right thing for the American people.
Yeah, is there a better way of cleaning up Wall Street other than expecting the president to do it for us?
Unfortunately, no. There isn't any legal way of doing it. And you know, what I find particularly frustrating about it is the one thing that 0.1% hasn't figured out is how to pay someone else to serve your prison sentence. So if you prosecuted Jamie Dimon under RICO and you put him in jail for 30 years, that would have a ripple effect on Wall Street. All of a sudden, a lot of people would be retiring to their horse farms in Connecticut because they decided that they had enough of Wall Street. And it would clean up the behavior overnight. So this is a problem which is so easily fixed. And yet, until it's fixed, everyone is victimized by it.
I find it very comforting when you draw our attention to the very sobering fact that if governments prosecuted fraudsters in the banking system, that every person indicted would try to make a deal by providing information about someone else because they don't really like jail. You say that these corrupt banksters haven't yet worked out a way of actually getting other people to serve their jail time. Maybe that's coming up. But yeah, what can you say there?
Well, it's true. You know, this is something that Robert Kennedy understood when he was using the RICO statute to prosecute organized crime. And when we look back on it, organized criminals are kind of quaint compared to the criminals we have on Wall Street. And what was very effective in Robert Kennedy's pattern of prosecution is you go to the lower people down on the corporate ladder, and they know, because the minute they get counseled, then they're told that the name of the game is to give the government somebody bigger. So you very quickly get to the Jamie Dimons of Wall Street. And, you know, Eric Holder is very quick to say, well, these cases are very complicated to try and we can't win these cases. That's complete nonsense. He never tried one of these cases. I don't even know if he's competent to do so, but he's never tried to convict someone like Jamie Dimon. And that's certainly something I would love to do if I ever had the opportunity. I wouldn't shy away from it.
Yeah. Well, hopefully you may one day. Maybe we can look at some of the recommendations that you made in your book at how we can protect the financial system from being manipulated in the future by banking fraudsters. What do you say there?
Well, I think that the first thing we have to do is reenact Glass-Steagall, because it is absolute insanity that the average American, you know, hardworking people who earn $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year to support their families, they are backing up the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insures the deposits of financial institutions. And the banks take that money, depositors' money, and gamble with it. It's utter insanity. You know, and I think Bill Clinton bears a lot of responsibility for the repeal of Glass-Steagall. So number one, Glass-Steagall has to be reinstated completely. Number two, I think that the revolving door has to stop. I think there has to be an absolute prohibition against people who work for the government then going out and getting a job within a very short period of time with the companies that they were regulating. You hear story after story about how, you know, the SEC is about to prosecute someone and all of a sudden they decide not to prosecute them, and lo and behold, the person in charge of the investigation is going to work for the Wall Street firm that represented the prospective defendant. This happens all the time, and it's absolutely unacceptable. And there are some other suggestions that we've made in the book. One of them is that there's a lot of legislation that was put through in the United States which makes it virtually impossible for firms to be sued for securities fraud. And those laws have to be repealed because the public and the legal system play a very, very important role, in my view, in policing financial crimes. And the movement over the last 25 to 30 years has been to protect the criminals at the expense of the individuals. And the pendulum has swung so far in that direction that we're seeing what we're seeing, which is this unbelievable concentration of wealth and people who feel that they're not accountable to anybody. And in fact, they're not, because they control the court system, they control the executive branch of the government, they control the legislative branch of the government. So, you know, they have absolute power.
Helen, can you tell us just a little bit about the lender liability scheme and the obligation it puts on financial institutions like JPMC?
Sure. You know, it's ironic for me because I invented the term lender liability in the early 1980s. I liked the alliterative sound of it, and I was fascinated by cases which were coming down in the 1980s where courts were holding banks liable to their borrowers. That was like an oxymoron. How could a bank be liable to a borrower? Well, there were loan agreements, and the banks routinely breached the loan agreements, and they thought they could do that with impunity because they were banks. And all of a sudden, there were some judges who were holding the banks liable for the damages caused by what the courts found were breaches of the loan agreements. Well, of course, there was a big reaction to that, and both by the courts and by the legislators. And so now it's much, much more difficult to sue a bank. And the courts are filled with people who consider it their patriotic duty to always rule in favor of a financial institution. So the moral standards that would apply to a 16-year-old kid who robs a 7-Eleven do not apply at all to someone who steals $3 billion from the public or files a false affidavit to foreclose on the home of some young man who's fighting in Afghanistan and is unaware that his home is being foreclosed on. There's just such a double standard now in the court system. We have to take that back. We've got to recalibrate the scales of justice, because right now they're not operating to do anything but injustice.
Yeah, it's almost incomprehensible. I find it, just getting my head around it is, my brain's almost saying to me that it's not true.
I know.
It's just, you'd think this was part of a bad nightmare. But yeah, it's definitely true.
I know.
It's just amazing. I can't believe how far people will allow the system to get before anything happens. It's amazing.
Yeah, and you know, I've been talking about this, the all this impacting Americans, but of course, all the financial institutions that we're talking about, HSBC, Bank of America, Citibank, JP Morgan, they operate internationally. So they're victimizing people all over the world. It's not just that they're victimizing Americans.
Yeah. Well, we have a big problem over here too with private debt. I think it's the biggest on the planet over here, 210% of GDP, and we've got a massive housing bubble here, which Professor Steve Keen says will fall by about 70%. So yeah, the banks are doing a good job here as well of making everyone's life a complete nightmare. So yeah, it's they're very unusual times. But Helen, you said that your experience with this fiasco at JPMC has changed your life fundamentally, and that you now have a very different view about how you look at money. Can you tell us what's changed?
Well, when I made that comment, I was really thinking about having lost money with Madoff. And it's not that I had a great deal of money, but it was it was significant for me. And I think that a lot of people tend to think that money is much more important than their lives than it is. I think for some people, they derive their respect and their sense of who they are in the community from the amount of money they have, which is sad because really, I mean, in my view, I don't judge people by how much money they have. And in fact, if anything, it's probably an inverse judgment. So, you know, there are certain things that I like to spend money on. It's not, I like to fulfill my obligations, but I don't consider it, something where I need an infinite amount of money, and I wouldn't do something simply for the money. So I was really talking more about a personal worldview.
Yeah, I agree too, actually. I think people's sense of consciousness is very narrow when they're only pursuing money and staying busy with making money and protecting their money. It gets very boring after a while. It's okay in your 20s, but once you watch this game go for a few decades, it starts to get fairly boring. But yeah, I totally agree with you. I think there's a lot more to money and the pursuit of wealth, but try to convince people that's pretty difficult.
Well, you know, the thing is that we have this expression, you can't take it with you, but sometimes people are so greedy that I think, my God, maybe they figured out a way that they can take it with them.
Yeah, I've got some friends who I think are going to be buried with it, actually. But, so, Helen...
Like the Egyptian pharaohs.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. So, Helen, what are you up to these days?
Well, I actually have been thinking of writing another book. But I'm not sure that I will. I practice law full time, and it takes a lot of my time, and I'm at a point in my life where I actually would like to slow down a little bit. And practicing law full time and writing the book about J.P. Morgan Chase was a pretty intense proposition for me. So I actually have been trying to talk myself out of writing the next book, but
you'll probably have a new book within a couple of years, yeah. So, Helen, where can people get more information about this? Where can they buy your book?
You can buy the book by going to jpmadoff, madoff.com. It's right on the homepage. You can buy the book. And you can go to amazon.com and get the Kindle version, and there's no charge for the Kindle version if you're a member of Amazon. And the advantage of getting the Kindle version is if you are the kind of reader I am, where I don't like to read something unless someone explains to me where that fact came from, because I like to understand whether I can believe what I read. And we were pretty compulsive about backing up every statement we make in the book. And with the Kindle version, you can just go right to the footnote, and then it links to the source material. So, you know, for those people who want to read the backup, they might want to get the Kindle version.
Okay, fantastic. Just so everyone knows, this is not fiction, okay? It sounds like fiction, but it's not fiction. It's terrifying. But that's just the way it is. It's a fantastic book. One last question, Helen. Who's going to be president after Obama?
Well, I think that I actually am not enthusiastic about Hillary, but I don't think that we have a rational alternative. So I think it's going to be Hillary.
Fingers crossed it's not too damaging.
Right.
Well,
right.
Helen, thanks for taking the time to come on today. Fantastic interview, and I wish you luck in all of your future endeavours.
Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking with you.
Great. Thank you.
Madoff doesn't have a lot to do now, and I think that he likes to be able to talk to people who are interested in what he has to say. I think that he enjoys the conversations because there aren't a lot of people that he can talk to about all of this stuff.
Bernie Madoff, when he first went into jail, he gave an interview. And in that interview, Bernie Madoff said, "Why are you guys even talking to me? The federal government, the U.S. government, is running the biggest Ponzi scheme in the world."